Welcome to the Lentil Intervention Podcast, talking all things movement, whole food nutrition and environmental wellness with your hosts, Ben and Emma.
Hello everybody and welcome to episode 12. Today's episode covers a very topical conversation for those living in New Zealand, and one could even say exacerbated by the drought we're experiencing in Auckland and further north. But I can assure you that this will absolutely apply to Australia and other parts of the world for sure. Now on the show we have already had Brad Dalrymple, who spoke about water quality and specifically ocean pollution, which was then followed by Yasmin Debu and Dr. Andrew Knight, the co-authors of the New Zealand Green Protein Report, who spoke about the effects of agriculture on New Zealand's water quality. So I'm super excited for our next guest, as what he will be sharing will most definitely hit home. And personally, ever since I first attended a presentation of his, I've become even more aware with what I've been seeing on my super long runs and mountain bikes in our supposed clean green bush. My name is Ben Alderberg, coming to you from Auckland, New Zealand, and joined as always by Emma Strutt in Boona, Queensland. Emma, hello, and who have we got today?
Hi Ben, hi everyone. We have the brilliant Dr. Mike Joy joining us today. He's an award-winning freshwater ecologist and environmental scientist. He's an associate editor of 2 scientific journals and has been working for 2 decades at the interface of science and policy in New Zealand. Now, Mike has played an integral role in the recently launched Better Futures Forum and is an outspoken advocate for environmental protection after seeing firsthand the decline in freshwater health in New Zealand. So I'm extremely grateful that we have such a knowledgeable guest today to discuss our food system and what needs to change moving forward. So Mike, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Great, no worries. It's nice to be here. Thanks, Emma and Ben.
Brilliant. Mike, so like I said, huge fan, well, maybe not for all the right reasons, in the sense that what you do is enlighten us as to what the reality is, you know, with the current state of our water quality and our general land. But let's start from the beginning. Let's talk a little bit about yourself. Tell us what you've studied, why the direction you've taken. Tell us a little bit about your personal journey.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm really different from a lot of academics in that I didn't go to university until I was 33. I never walked through the door of a university till I was 33, and then I embarked on a on a undergrad, master's, and PhD journey of 10 years. But before that, grew up in rural Canterbury. The family moved to Wellington, and I did last couple of years of school there. I didn't do very well at school. I think I did academically okay, but I got suspended quite a few times and asked never to come back again. And
dare we ask why?
I'd love to say that I was standing up for something, like school strike for climate or something. But
yeah.
Mostly it was just about being allowed. Loving cars. I had a car before I was old enough to have my license, and it was just cars and girls that got me into trouble. So nothing,
Very cool.
that I could be proud of there, But then a whole series of jobs. You name it, I did it. Driving taxis and buses and trucks, and I installed air conditioning. I was a diesel technician. I worked on a dairy farm. Was my first a year on a dairy farm, virtually straight out of school, in the Manawatu in New Zealand, and then sailing the Pacific Ocean, restored an old yacht and sailed around, and
oh wow,
all sorts of cool things like that, and including a year in Australia on an outback sheep station. Sort of seeing the extremes of what happens when it doesn't rain for 4 years and you're trying to farm sheep on a landscape where they do not belong, which I'm sure had a big influence later on how I thought. And then sort of had been able to do all these jobs. It was the good old days when you could just walk. When you got sick of a job at lunchtime, you just went next door and got another one, so but sort of around the 90s when I decided to go to, my partner and I both sort of gave up work and decided to go to university. It wasn't so easy to get a job. Things were getting tougher. And so, around 1993, went to uni, and then did that 10 years, sorry, of for me, undergrad, BSc, MSc, and then a PhD in freshwater ecology, and then just kind of a whole bunch of influences along there, inspiration from lecturers, and more freshwater became the thing that I was really, really interested in, and through that process, I went from being the most mild-mannered, kind of shy and retiring person you would ever meet, to becoming quite angry and outspoken towards the end of it, and that's just carried on. And that was anger. It wasn't any, and it's still anger. It's anger at, I guess, feeling like, well, I mean, I don't know if it was the same for you, Ben, but being brought up believing, or being told that we're so lucky to live in this, and I guess it's Australia's called the lucky country as well, isn't it? We are told how lucky we are to live in these amazing places, clean, green New Zealand, and so the anger, I think, comes from the realization that that we are no more clean and green, and that we're trashing it so fast that even in the short time that I was doing my field work and my master's and PhD, I would go back to sites. Well, I was mostly working on native fish and using them as an assessment of the health of rivers, and even in that short time, going back to places, and every time I went back, things were worse. Fish had disappeared, damage had happened, and so just more and more was speaking up because I'm angry, and I feel that that we're losing something that we won't be able to replace, all for nothing mostly.
Yeah, and you've been quite outspoken about that, 100% pure kind of catchphrase, haven't you?
Yeah, well, I mean, that was the classic, the thing that kind of raised my profile, I guess, was that I'd written a paper and then an op-ed that was in the New Zealand Herald about how we're kidding ourselves about our clean green image, and just had a whole lot of statistics there about how bad we are really in global comparison. We have more threatened species than, proportionally more threatened species than any other country in the world, and a whole bunch of really bad statistics. And our new Prime Minister back in about 2014, I think it was, John Key, was just a new Prime Minister for New Zealand, and he was in the UK for one of the royal gatherings, a wedding or something, and he was interviewed on a pretty hard-hitting BBC TV show called Hard Talk, and the interviewer was a guy called Stephen Sacker, and I don't know what happened. I think that John Key wasn't prepared, or his minders didn't kind of warn him what he was going to be in for, because he really, I think because he had and has an easy run in New Zealand. Nobody seems to challenge him, but and so he got called out on this clean green thing, and he famously said, well, that's Mike Joy's opinion. The Sacker's reading out all these statistics, and he says, well, that's Mike Joy's opinion, but scientists are just like lawyers. You can always go get another opinion, which is hilarious, because he's never come up with this other opinion. But it was it was funny, because even lawyers were upset about that.
Wow.
So yeah, and so that really, I guess, got so much coverage that it meant that the phone never stopped ringing for a week or so afterwards, with different TV interviews and radio interviews and that kind of thing, in response to that BBC Hard Talk program. And I see it's often the YouTube clip of it has been viewed heaps and heaps of times. I mean, there was a whole hour's interview, but that one bit was the bit that most people jumped on.
Well, it just goes to show no publicity is bad publicity. But
well, I've had some bad stuff, but yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what, this is probably the only time and the only opportunity I'll have on this whole show to correct you. I didn't grow up in New Zealand. I'm actually from South Africa. But but on that point though, and it's still very valid, is living, so I'm from South Africa, also very much, it's Africa, it's the big, beautiful outdoors and the wild savannas, the oceans, etc. But the picture I always had of New Zealand was this clean green image, because that is what it was always marketed as. Coming to New Zealand, probably about 16 years ago now, 17 years, I've very quickly started questioning that status of clean green, because your work, it's getting into the elements that we can't see, you're testing waters and so on, but even visually, from what we could see on the surface of it, one could already start seeing, is it really clean green? It's and there's so many facets of it, which I know we'll get into it, but that is interesting that even coming from the outside, I started questioning that quite some time ago.
Yeah, and I mean, that is the problem. You sort of touched on it there with that, whether it's visible or not. And in that way, the nutrients and nitrate in drinking water that we'll talk about is because people can't see it. It doesn't turn the river a different color or anything like that. In the same way that carbon in the atmosphere is not visible, then people tend to discount it. If the rivers were bright red, if nitrogen turned rivers bright red, I've always thought that we would not have this problem. It's only because we can't see it. That's a big part of why we don't do anything.
It's the same thing with plastic in the oceans, and Brad Dalrymple spoke about this. What you see on YouTube clips and so on of plastic bottles and plastic bags floating is a small percentage, because the PCBs, what they break down to, those tiny particles that you cannot see, that is the problem. The bottles floating in the ocean is not actually as much the problem. It's what's broken down into those microparticles that ends up into the food chain system, etc., and so many other ways. So to kick off, I guess, this conversation, let's start off with a very broad question. What are the big issues we are currently facing from an environmental point of view in New Zealand? What are the big issues here?
Well, I mean, I guess that like all of the world where climate change is a biggie, and it's a symptom. I always get a bit frustrated with climate change gets so much, because it is incredibly important, but it's kind of seen as a problem on its own. But it's a symptom of a planet and economic systems that drive growth. And so we've had incredible growth both in human and cow numbers, animal numbers, and impacts in New Zealand. And so they're linked together. So climate change, I guess, is kind of overriding everything. But at the same time, we are polluting our waterways at the same time as we're polluting the atmosphere. The bunch of greenhouse gases that come from intensive agriculture. So to kind of put it in perspective, if you think about a population of New Zealanders I think it's just got to 5 million. We have about 10 million cattle. But when you look at the impacts, human equivalents, then it's between 14 and 44, depending on what you're looking at, human equivalents for every cattle beast, especially dairy cows. And this is really important for people to understand too, that dairy cows, lactating dairy cows are like a car. If you think of your car, when we're sitting around our engines just idling, but a lactating cow is running at full revs, because they've got to produce all that milk, and so the whole system is sped up. And so the waste side of course, there's a lot more goes in and a lot more goes out of a lactating cow. So so 6.5 million dairy cattle, and about the rest are beef. So 10 million equals the impacts minimum of 140 million humans. But much higher than that for some of the other things. So 5 million versus 140 million, and you see what the problem is in New Zealand. It's sure humans are bad and having huge impacts in their wastewater side of things, but when it comes to freshwater and greenhouse gas emissions, then half of our greenhouse gas emissions come from animal agriculture, and most of our freshwater impacts come from animal agriculture. But we don't have a huge area in horticulture, but where we do have it is very polluting as well, for the same reasons that we're not, that it's a very industrial system. And I guess it's kind of hard for people and for your listeners to understand, some animals running around out in the paddock, how can that be harmful? How can it be different, say, from bison or or ungulates running around in Africa. How could that be? How could that be different? And the difference that you need to understand is that that if they were at a natural stocking rate, if we had cows on our land at the rate at which the grass, that they would have grass the year round without adding anything, then we wouldn't have a problem. We have a problem because we have a stocking rate much, much higher than that. And to achieve, we get that by adding nitrogen fertilizer and lots of it. And just reminder here, it'll come up again, but that nitrate fertilizer is fossil fuel derived. So we use a huge amount of, a third of the nitrogen fertilizer in New Zealand comes from Kapuni or from our Taranaki gas fields, 2/3 from the Middle East, and so that's how you. And then we're also the biggest importer in the world of palm kernel. So that's I think most of the listeners will know about the problems and the environmental problems with palm oil production in Indonesia and Asia. Well, we're a part of that because we take the kernel after they process the plant to make the oil. Then this bit of the seed that's left over is used as a stock feed here. We import huge amounts of it, 23.
So the irony is that there are so many people that are passionate about avoiding products that consume food products that contain palm oil because of the destructive nature and the extinction of orangutans and so on. Yet they could be vegetarian or just general diet, and they don't realize how much they're still impacting that palm industry by virtue of the fact that they're consuming meat or consuming dairy, because we are feeding our livestock. A byproduct of that.
When you think about it, it's what we're actually doing is importing nutrients. So those parts of that plant in a natural system would fall back on the ground and be recycled back into growing more the next generation kind of thing. A natural cycle of nutrient processing, but no, because we shifted across the world, and it's sort of linked also to some other pretty stupid things we do. We ship huge amounts of unprocessed Pinus radiata logs overseas, and these ships would be coming back empty, but a good backload for them is to come back bringing palm kernel from the same places they're taking the pine trees to, virtually. And so that's a big part of it, then so we have these unnaturally high rates, and that's where you get the leaky systems. So that we put the nitrogen on the paddock to grow the grass then is eaten by the cow. Most of it, nearly all of it, a tiny proportion of it goes into the milk. The rest goes through the cow, out through urine, and then and if anyone's seen a cow urinate, they'll know that it's just this big kind of gush of liquid, not spread out at all, just sort of dumped on the ground. And so that's putting nitrogen onto the paddock at a rate that's 100 times higher than a fertilizer spread. And so there's no way that the plants can take that up. It just goes down straight. Well, not straight, depending on the soil. In places like Canterbury and Southland, where you've got very stony soils, they just go down, directly down through and into the aquifers or across into the waterways, and then cause the problems that we can talk about later on. But that's why it's not just having animals running around and on the grass and on paddocks is seen as a good thing, as opposed to having them inside in a shed. But in this case, it's not a good thing, because at that intensity, you're actually putting a lot of nitrogen into the system. Whereas if you had them in a shed, you could collect that up, you do collect it up, and then you irrigate it back onto the paddock at a rate that the plants can take it up. So this is a sort of one of these mixed messages where people think it's green to have their milk and dairy products come from pasture-based systems, but those pasture-based systems are actually harmful processes because of the way we do it, not because it has to be. If we didn't put all those external things in there and had a natural stocking rate, then it would be a green thing and a healthy thing to do, but not the level we're doing it at.
And then in between, if it is considered sort of another option, there's the concept that I've started hearing some environmentalists talk about, is the regenerative agricultural practices, which there's different forms of explanations, but the way that I understand it is it's based on how wild animals used to roam, in herds, super tight packs, mainly to protect the young, the vulnerable, the pregnant, and so on. So there's a high concentration of animals on one particular piece of land. They're eating everything. There's all the manure, everything that's dropping. They trampling on it. They move off. That piece of land looks like it's been destroyed, but then along comes the rain and everything regenerates. But this is a concept to me that seems to, well, it's Africa. It's big game parks. It's big wild areas. That's not really practical in farming, or is it? I mean...
Well, I mean, there's kind of, you sort of got part of it there, but regenerative farming doesn't have to include animals. I mean,
right.
It covers a whole lot of things, agroforestry and all that kind of thing. It's kind of a catch-all term for caring about the soil and doing it. But sure, but that animal movement part of it, if you looked at how many animals there were in South Africa and divided it by the area and got a stocking rate, then it would be, even under natural conditions, it would be incredibly low. So, like you're saying, if you had, a stocking rate that was, far, far less, like a tenth of what we had now, and stock moved across the landscape like that, then you would have no or very little harm. So, it is what you're saying, but it's about stocking rate. It's about not having that intensity of farming.
Okay. No, I was just going to say, you've been talking about the greenhouse gas emissions associated with livestock, and oftentimes when people think of that, they think, CO2 or methane. But one that's not really talked about enough, I think, is probably the nitrous oxide. Would you be able to just kind of talk us through that process and why this one needs to be talked about a little bit more?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's really important to understand that nitrous oxide is 300 times more of a greenhouse gas. The effect of it is 300 times more higher per unit than carbon is. So a tiny amount of it is very, very harmful. And the sort of different systems that you have. So because we've hugely interrupted the nitrogen cycle, because we make it out of we humans figured out back in early 1900s how to do this chemical process, or turning
the
gas.
Haber-Bosch process.
Yeah, the Haber-Bosch. So we invented this thing, and then now we've interrupted the natural nitrogen cycle to the extent that we humans now create far more nitrogen, usable, oxidized nitrogen than any natural system does. We have totally altered that process, and so as part of that, there's nitrous oxide given off from the sort of conversion or the oxidization of that nitrogen, and so we're matched, and you can measure it the same as you can measure carbon in the atmosphere. You can measure parts per million nitrogen, and it's going up at a very similar rate to what carbon is. And this artificial nitrogen process that we're involved in is definitely a big part of that. And certainly housing, when I was saying about how you can mitigate some of the freshwater problems with nitrogen if you have intensive farming by putting cows inside or on a pad and then catching that nitrogen and irrigating it back onto the land. But then you increase if you have them inside and do that, then all of that urine lying around gases off and lets off a lot of nitrous oxide into the atmosphere. So you gain. The problem is that the system's broke. If you fiddle with it, the system's broken, that it's too intensive. And if you go, all right, we'll put them inside and that will save our waterways, well then, that you'll improve the waterway situation, but you'll make the atmosphere much worse because of that nitrous oxide loss.
And that actually depletes ozone, does it?
Yeah, and it's also, that's right, that's also an ozone depleting gas as well. So it's something that's another product of industrial farming that we have to think about.
But now, another issue with the way that the world farms is that it's very reliant on fossil fuels, as you've mentioned, but it's a declining resource.
Yeah, the extreme is, and I've just been looking at the paper itself, but in the USA, for every 1 calorie of energy, basically what food is energy. I know there's much more than that in it, but for us, that's what keeps our motor running. One calorie needs 21 calories of fossil fuel to create 1 calorie of food in the States. And it's,
talk about efficiency.
Yeah, exactly. If you grew it in your garden and then, grew it naturally, food in your garden, and just went outside, plucked a piece and ate it, you'll be 1 for 1, But so it's the processing, it's the fertilizer, it's the harvesting, it's the mechanization of the whole process, plus that, a whole, huge amount of the food that's eaten is highly processed as well, like processed into products, but also the processing and the transporting. And it's the most incredibly inefficient sort of food production system you can imagine, and so we have to think about that side of the equation as well, where it's inefficient. And when one of the big issues we're going to have to deal with as a global population is that there's a bunch of papers now that have shown quite clearly that if we didn't have, using our current food system globally, if we didn't have synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, we would feed less than 3 billion people, so quite a bit less than half the population of the world could be fed if we took synthetic nitrogen out of the system.
But you're talking about a standard diet that's a typical Western diet. Yes. Okay.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, no, the diets that, so you're just averaging it across the planet at the moment. So, it's not like we couldn't feed the world without it. It's we couldn't feed the world without it under our current diets with animals in the process. So and animals are incredibly inefficient, at giving us protein, energy in, energy out. They're incredibly inefficient, obviously, because you've got a whole animal that you've got to run, that has got to run around, for years in a paddock or however long. It's a really, you can just easily imagine if you didn't eat the animal and ate the food that the animal was going to eat directly, that's kind of, it's a bit stupid, but that's why it's inefficient, and so but it's one of the realities that we have to face up to.
Yeah, and I was reading your paper, Our Deadly Nitrogen Addiction, and you've mentioned there that the nitrogen cycle at the moment is more than 3 times the safe upper limit. So that's quite significant.
Yeah.
Could you maybe just talk a little bit about where this extra nitrogen ends up? Because I know you mentioned that only about 17% actually ends up in the food that we eat. So a lot of it ends up in the soil and our waterways. What is that doing to our waterways?
Okay, well, it does things, and it's not just the waterways, it's not just the rivers. Of course, the rivers flow into estuaries, they flow into lakes, and they flow into the ocean. So I'll maybe go to the far end first, into the ocean.
Absolutely.
And that's where we have dead zones. So famous one, there's a bunch of them, but the famous one is off the mouth of the Mississippi River in the States,
Mexico,
off the Gulf of Mexico, and there's a huge area there. Add it all up, and it's more than the total land area of New Zealand that are dead zones, and they're totally dead because the nutrient levels are so high. You get the growth of algae and plants and bacteria that just soak up all of the oxygen, and then there's no oxygen left for the rest of the life in the system. The nutrients are the base of the food chains in these systems, but like everything, too much of something is a bad thing, and you get oxygen depletion. So that's the dead zones. A similar thing happens in the lakes, but it tends to be a bit more seasonal because there's flushes that clean it out. So in our lakes, we have algal blooms, we have toxic algal blooms. 40% of, or more than 44% of the monitored lakes in New Zealand are considered polluted, and that they've flipped into another trophic state because of excess nutrients. So they're not natural anymore. They've gone into another state, and they can't handle it. So you get oxygen depletion causing all sorts of problems, and you get changes in the natural cycles that happen. In waterways, it's a little different in that the algae in the rivers is not in the water column like it is in the lakes and the oceans, where it's plankton, phytoplankton we call it. In the rivers, it's benthic algae. Benthic means on the bottom. So you in the big slow rivers, you might get them turn a sort of a dark greeny color like you would see in a lake where that's phytoplankton, algae that's in the water column. But in rivers, it forms like a slimy, starting off with a slimy base, and then it can go into long filamentous algae, and it can grow really fast. But the situation is the same, where it takes up the oxygen. So during the day, you have oxygen increases. Photosynthesis is happening, oxygen is being given off, and you get increasing oxygen levels in the river during the day that go up in the late afternoon some of the rivers even with quite mild amounts of nitrogen in them that are being monitored constantly for oxygen. In summertime will go up. They become super trophic. They go up to 160, 170% dissolved oxygen. It should be around 100 for healthy life. But then at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, at the other end of the diurnal cycle, they'll go down to 30% of 30% dissolved oxygen, and virtually nothing can live in that. A few fish species can adapt to it. Like I know some people will have seen if you have a goldfish in a bowl and without an aerator, that the goldfish will sort of gulp air off the surface. And virtually none of our native fish species can do that. They're not adapted to it, so they just die. If they can detect the oxygen, they move on, or they go down and try and find some upwelling zones to get some oxygen. But most of them, and the invertebrates, are killed by the lack of oxygen. So that's a direct secondary effect. So it's not the nutrients, it's not the nitrogen that's killing the life. It's the effect that it has on the ecosystem, which is growing lots of algae. I mean, it would be the same if you had a human in a glass tank or sealed up the room completely and didn't have any plants in there, then we would die through lack of oxygen. If we had a whole lot of plants in there, it could go the other way, where you get these big fluctuations. It's just photosynthesis happening, but it's happening in a river, in a system that it can't get out of, and the fluctuations are too extreme for the life.
And it's not just, the life in the rivers and the oceans. In 2018, there was a Danish study that reported the link between the nitrates in drinking water and the risk of developing colorectal cancer. Yeah. And I think you've mentioned that a couple of times. You did some testing in some New Zealand waterways.
Yeah, so if people wanted to read more about it, I don't know if you guys can put up the link to it, but there's a Conversation article and a Newsroom article that I just recently did. And I'm part of a research group as well with Otago University School of Medicine in Wellington, Victoria, and Auckland University. And we've just had a really amazing master's student as part of this group who's pulled together data on drinking water for about 4 million New Zealanders. Wow. And so we know what people are drinking in New Zealand, or at least we know from the public supplies, the commercial supplies. And there is a very frighteningly high correlation between nitrate and drinking water in New Zealand and colorectal cancer rates. New Zealanders will, if they read about this, will be worried in that we have the highest rates of colorectal cancer basically in the developed world of countries that keep records. We have the highest rates, and within New Zealand the highest rates are in Canterbury and South Canterbury and Southland, where nitrate levels are very high in aquifers down there, because, and it's very recent, it's happened in the last 40, 50 years with the intensification, especially the last 20 odd years of agriculture in those areas and irrigation, so that you have lots of water flushing through from irrigation, but also dairy farming happening, and where it never would have. It's only because we alter the ecosystem by adding all this water that we get this problem. So it's a real emerging issue for all of us. the Danish paper you mentioned, there's also a big USA study, a Spanish study, and there's some interesting work being done on the health costs of that as well that we can talk about.
So is tap water safe?
It's well, I mean, some New Zealanders found out how unsafe it is. We had thousands of people poisoned recently in Havelock North.
In Havelock North, the Hawke's Bay.
Yeah, in the Hawke's Bay because of animal feces getting into that water. That's a separate issue. That's the E. coli. But the nitrate, and again, it's a big problem because it's almost impossible to get it out of the water. You can't filter it out. You can't go buy a filter or something like that. So what happens in places like Canterbury and Southern, where Canterbury certainly, all of the drinking water in public supplies comes from groundwater in different parts of New Zealand. So, Ben, are you in Auckland? Or?
I'm in Auckland, yeah.
Yeah. So Auckland's different in that.
Yes.
Well, normally, if it's not a drought, it's coming out of, mostly out of your Waitakere and Hunua ranges.
That's right. But they are trying to get water out of the Waikato River.
Well, they have been getting water out of the Waikato River.
They just want to increase the amount.
Yeah.
But now the Waikato region is also another heavy dairy farming region.
Yeah. Well, actually, the levels. So I can't. This is really tricky because I know roughly what the levels are, where the intake is on the Waikato River, and they vary a bit because there's a lot of flushing flow comes in from Lake Taupo, and
even though Lake Taupo recently had, and to our listeners, I'm just going to quickly, if our listeners are getting a little bit like, whatever, I think the water's fine. Hang on, for athletes out there, they will recall very recently Lake Taupo had a serious algae bloom outbreak and this is becoming more prevalent, that the swim was cancelled in a major triathlon event because of the water quality. And in the Rotorua regions, at least one of the lakes, I think, has had some serious issues in terms of the nitrate levels being super high. And I think, I stand to be correct on this, I think they're trying to flush one lake with another to try and get levels back to some kind of normality. But it is very prevalent. That water quality is certainly becoming an issue.
I mean, you're right, and we can talk about that and what they're doing in Lake Rotorua and Taupo. But and so what I was trying to say though was that I mean, you're right, and there is high levels of nitrate in the Waikato River, but the tributaries tend to be much worse than the main stem. But the water sampling data that we've got for drinking water in Auckland is kind of an average based over years, and most of the time that data's been collected, the water's been coming out of those the dams that don't have a nitrate problem.
Yeah.
So normally you're getting a dilution from those lakes. I don't know how they decide who in Auckland gets water from where. I don't know whether South Auckland gets Waikato River water or and I can't find out. But looking at the numbers that we do have, it looks like they're getting a mix. But when there's a drought like now, you won't be getting a mix. You'll be getting 100% Waikato River water, and so you will be getting higher than normal nitrate levels in your drinking water. But the trouble with this is that like all cancers, it's very, very hard to nail down a cancer to a particular cause. You could take someone who's smoked all their life and they get lung cancer, right? You could not prove that the smokes gave that person lung cancer. But you can look at population studies and go, well, if you smoke, heavily for years, your chances of getting lung cancer increase with that time. And it's the same with nitrate in drinking water. So it's an accumulation over time. You can't just go and have a glass of high nitrate water and then get cancer. It's accumulation time, and that's the problem. Is that's what makes it so much harder to kind of nail down the issue as well. Because
Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say because Kiwis and probably Aussies too move around so much. I mean, the European studies tend to be clearer because people tend to stay in one place a bit longer and maybe live in a village or a town or a house for their whole lives, rather than we tend to be a bit more mobile, don't we?
I was just going to say it's kind of ironic that livestock are contributing to the nitrates in the drinking water. which could then lead to bowel cancer, but they're also contributing to bowel cancer through processed meat and red meat consumption. So.
Well, but it's actually the same process. So what happens with the nitrate in drinking water? The body converts it to nitrite, which is the problem. The nitrite's the cancer-related thing which you get from those meats. So I mean, if you're drinking eating the processed meats, and it's just adding to it with the
getting
water
it one
and
way or the other. Yeah.
But now with this water quality issue or concern, however we want to put it, we're also now creating an even bigger problem on the other end, because people say, well, if water quality is poor, I'm just going to buy more bottled water.
Yeah.
And so two issues with that. One, more plastic. And we've already had a guest on the show talk all day long about, plastic in our oceans, plastic in our environment. But then from an economy point of view, in New Zealand especially, and it happens in other parts of the world, a big overseas corporate comes, takes the water from our ground for free, and then sells it back to us. Now, that is just not an efficient process whatsoever. Secondly, they're taking our premium water, leaving us with the lower end quality, and we're having to buy that back, plus consuming a lot of plastic. Maybe PCBs have leached into the water in the interim. It's just causing all sorts of other complications.
Yeah, and it makes me really angry, because I suspect that Coca-Cola, while Fonterra might have me on their dartboard, Coca-Cola will have me on their, employee of the day of the year. Because as I highlight these issues, that's the thing. And even the medical officer of health is warning people in South Canterbury to buy bottled water, because the levels of nitrate are so high.
Who would have thought in a first world country will be told or advised to buy bottled water?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's because at the moment our maximum allowable value is 11.3 milligrams per litre, which is the World Health Organization limit. So it covers most of the world. Mm-hmm. That is the level where it's a problem for young children, for babies that are in that first few months of life, when they're kind of converting from their mother's milk oxygen supply through the mother's blood to their own. And nitrogen will bind instead of oxygen, or instead of hemoglobin, and you get this problem. But the level where so for the listeners, so think of 11 milligrams being the limit at the moment for mothers with young babies. The level where it starts to be a problem in drinking water is 1/10 of that. It's around 1 milligram, where you have a significant increase in the chance of getting colorectal cancer. And so current standard is nowhere near the limit that's the health, when it comes to colorectal cancer, because this number 11.3 has been around for at least 50 years. The science has been known on that. The colorectal cancer science has only been coming out, well, it's been around for a while, but only the really big studies and the strong data has only come out in the last, 5 or 10 years. So we haven't had the response from government yet, although there is a working group within government to look at this issue. All around the world, governments are very slow to respond to that, emerging science around it. And so one of the most recent papers in the US on colorectal cancer and nitrate have made some estimates of health costs, and they are actually incredibly frightening costs, the health impact costs of colorectal cancer. And so you can look at that. In the European Union, they did a study where they included health and environmental costs, and they looked at the increase in value that, and this is in the I can't remember the numbers exactly, but they're in my deadly nitrogen addiction paper. But the range of value that nitrogen adds to the economy or to the farming production system is about 1/3 of the range of costs to society and to the environment. So, and I mean, we've done a similar study here that if you actually had to pay the costs of the harm that the nitrogen does, or anywhere near the cost, then you wouldn't do it. So the costs to society are far higher than the gains that
That's right.
in economic terms,
I've just got the paper up, and you've said
yeah.
it, the benefit is between 20 to 80 billion, whereas the estimated cost is between 70 to 320 billion.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
that's right.
And to convert that, just so New Zealanders can get an idea of the economics of that, and you mentioned it being so Lake Rotorua and
Yes.
Lake Taupō are the two places in New Zealand where we've decided, as in I don't know who, I mean, it has been decided that they're the two lakes that are so important that we're going to do something about the nitrate levels in those lakes to protect them. And so farmers have been paid not to farm intensively in those catchments. So it happened a few years ago in Lake Taupō. We paid $90 million to a bunch of farmers to not farm in that catchment, and a cap and trade system was set up on nitrate limits. Currently in Lake Rotorua, we are paying, that means we taxpayers and a little bit from regional council, from ratepayers, we're paying $40 million to a bunch of farmers, that are in that catchment, not to have animals, not to intensively farm in those catchments. And when you work out, so they want to get, in the case of Lake Rotorua, you work out how much they need to, the scientists have said, we've got to stop this much nitrogen from going in there. It works out to $400 per kilogram of nitrate that's being lost in that system to protect that lake. So we are paying farmers to not farm to protect those two lakes. If we applied that same logic to the rest of New Zealand, then it would be, I lost count,
24 billion. I saw you say in a presentation.
And I know that's an underestimate, because I know in Canterbury alone it's $12 billion, and the numbers come from the regional council. How much nitrogen is lost to freshwater in that area? They can measure it in the aquifers and the rivers, and it's $12 billion. So, which is more than, that's around the total income for dairy for the whole country.
I was going to say that's costing more to stop. In terms of what they're actually earning from that, it's costing more to stop them from.
Totally.
No one ever talks about the true cost, though, do they?
No,
leave that out of their numbers.
Right. You're right, Emma. If we applied this to a whole lot of things we do, it would look at this is externalities we're talking about, and if we applied that to a bunch of things that we think are so good for the economy, but actually they're only good for the economy because we don't charge for the externalities. It's like this weird accounting system where we only look at what it brings in. Imagine if you, I don't know, ran a cafe or something like that, and you just, who cares about what it cost? This is how much I had over the till, over the counter. Or it doesn't work like that in reality. And it's actually worse than a business situation, because I think about this in terms of environmental debt. There's another way of thinking. I mean, a lot of people are worried about the economic debt that we're building up with the COVID response. But the thing about economic debt is, you can write it off, you can go bankrupt, you can whatever. We created that. We can easily forget it as well. Whereas ecological debt, you can't do that. That nitrate in drinking water or in the groundwaters and the rivers and the lakes and the oceans doesn't go away. You can't go declare bankruptcy and the rivers are all clean again, start from scratch. We are stuck with that forever. So I think if it comes to a choice between ecological debt and economic debt, I'll take economic any day. That's it's so just simple.
Is that approach in Taupō and Rotorua actually working though?
Well, it has worked. I mean, it's not 100%, but we know that getting, because what I know the process, and what happens is that the scientists say we need to get 200 tons less, and then there's a whole lot of negotiation goes on with industry and everybody having a go, and then it gets cut down to about half that is the usual story. So it would have been way less, put it that way. It would have been way less, and Rotorua has responded really quickly through the use of alum in the short term. So that's it's aluminium basically. You're flocking out the phosphate that's causing the problem there. So you get rid of the algae needs two things in a lake to grow. It needs phosphate and nitrate. And if you can get rid of one of them, then the other one, then it won't, it still won't grow. So they've kind of taken this cheating approach, which is to tip in a whole lot of this aluminium into the lake, which will flock out the sediment that contains the phosphorus, and then it sits on the bed of the lake, and it can't, and hopefully it stays there, and so you reduce the phytoplankton, but you just create another problem.
I was going to say, aluminium is not. Yeah. It's something else that's not good for us. So
it's. I mean, I crack up and cry at the same time, because a bunch of wastewater treatment plants around the country, including one not far from me, that can't meet their requirements, their consent conditions around phosphate discharge into the river. They have tanker loads of alum come down every week from Auckland, and they mix the alum with the discharge.
Wow.
Then it flocks it out. So then you have this aluminium-rich toxic sediment that pile up. Well, you're supposed to go to landfill, but what they do in this case is they pile it into little piles on the floodplain around the wastewater treatment plant. And then when they have a big flood, it all washes away into the river, and you don't have the problem anymore. So,
wow.
but
we don't learn our lessons, do we?
And there's another reason to not eat fish. There's another reason. We've always spoken about heavy metals. Now it's PCBs, and now fresh water. Fresh water. It's not the oceans. It's different. Well, hello. Yeah. There we go. Oh, this is horrific. And the reason why I asked whether it actually works, which was a bit of a rhetorical question, is because we know that there's the theory and then there's the practicality of when you're negotiating with a system that's been so well ingrained. The algae bloom example I mentioned, I mean, that was recent. That was a year ago, a year and a half ago, or so.
Well, no, I think as much as it kind of really grates with me that you're paying people to not do something harmful, but the difference is that it is an ambulance at the top of the cliff, whereas the alum is a fence at the top of the cliff, whereas the alum response, or what either other things that you come up with, then they're the ambulance that you never win, because you just keep constantly trying to fix something when you need to stop putting it in there in the first place.
That's just not sustainable, because it's like paying me not to go stab someone in the street. It's just, it's not. And it's almost, to me, when you say that, it's almost like farmers are going to take advantage of that. I'll buy that piece of land and then I'll just milk the system, excuse the pun. And it's just not sustainable. It infuriates me when I hear things like this, because I came to a supposedly clean, green environment, and yet when you actually understand what's going on and what people are trying to do to fix, which is not, you're just putting another problem on top of another problem. It's just never going to end.
The difference has been that this is kind of at the core of what we're talking about, is that there's money, there's a whole lot of money. It's great for GDP having tanker loads of alum going to, Lake Rotorua. There's no money in not doing something, but there's a lot of money in cleaning up stuff, and so that's always the issue.
So I'm gonna digress a little bit here, because I do know you talk a little bit about this. So we're moving away a little bit from water, although it'll probably come straight back. Forest carbon credits.
Yeah.
I think the laugh says it all. Now, I know it's become a little bit topical as well, because it's actually been on the news, and there's also, I've always thought it's a bit of a con, this process. Let me be a bad Kiwi, let me pollute, let me do all, let me fly as much as I want, or eat as much meat as I want, or let me contribute to the pollution, but then I'll just pay some money and plant a few trees. Now, we know the benefit of trees, sure, but again, it's not a sustainable system. Now, what I've also started seeing is that apparently the trees we're planting are now adding another problem.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like all these things, when you kind of artificially do things, you have problems. I mean, there's a couple of things that to mention with in relation to that. Okay, so one of the things is that pine plantations, and I'll have a whole lot of people attack me after this, but pine causes so many problems in New Zealand with its harvest and with its, I mean, you just go talk to the people on the East Cape of the North Island and the problems they've had with pine and destroying their beaches and rivers and all that kind of thing. But one of the flaws with the system is that our sequestration rates are calculated by a kind of physical measurement. So somebody, measures the circumference of a tree and then 5 years later measures it again, and you calculate from, just building on that So therefore it's sequestered X amount of carbon over time because it's grown by that much. And so they treat a pine tree as equal to a kauri tree, But what is totally missed in that is that in our native forests, it's not just the trees, it's all of the yarns, all of the things that grow up in the top of our trees and all of the build-up of carbon in the litter and the leaf litter on the forest floor and all of the powerful work that does for, cleaning water and all that kind of thing as well. But so the stuff that I've seen lately comparing, native forests to exotic forests in New Zealand is about 60% more, sort of 60% higher sequestration rates in healthy native forests than just measuring the trees would tell you, because as you could easily imagine, 60% of the carbon capture is happening not just in the tree, but in the tops of the tree and in the soils and the undergrowth. Whereas what a pine forest looks like, it's just pine trees basically.
And the article was just focusing on how much quicker it grows and how much more therefore it absorbs.
Yep.
But that's completely misconstrued.
That's missing a huge point. But okay, so the other thing that people, and it took me a while to get my head around this, but and I'll try and explain it. If you planted all of New Zealand or all of the world back in trees again, and you say, right, we're going to sequester all that carbon, and we would solve the problem if we planted all of the trees back. Say we could get rid of all the humans, or we could live in tree houses or whatever, and you could plant all the trees back again. Then all you're doing, you still haven't accounted for 1 kilogram of fossil fuel carbon. Because think about it, the fossil fuel carbon is the forests of the past. So we can sequester carbon in the current carbon cycle, but we're not counting for all of the forests that grew and fell down and grew and fell down and grew and fell down and grew and fell down over millions or a billion years. So there's no way, and then we pull it out of the ground and we release it through burning fossil fuels. Then there's no way you can sequester that again, because you'd have to take another billion years to sequester it all again. So we kid ourselves in so many ways when we think. I'm not saying don't plant trees is fantastic, and they have so many more benefits that other than just planting the right trees than just carbon capture and sequestration. But don't kid yourself that you're solving climate by doing it. You're
playing catch up. You'll always be playing catch up.
You're never gonna be a million years behind.
You're not even going to catch up. That's the reality. So there's more benefit in focusing on native forests, which helps
not cutting them down in the first place.
True, right. But I mean that's a bit late in most parts, especially New Zealand. But where there are some fantastic organisations that are trying to reintroduce or buying land back and reintroducing native plants. But that's helping the biodiversity again. That's helping bring back a lot of native birds, or helping the populations that are struggling. And so there's way more benefits in doing that than just a pine tree. And I do know all about pine trees, because that's where all the mountain biking is. You just ride in between those, and that's it.
You can't do that in native forests. But I mean, the other part of that too, Ben, is that it is crucial, and this is some work that Niwa's been doing. Actually measuring carbon dioxide in the Raukumara forests. And if you have a drought and you have lots of predators and lots of possums and pigs and goats and all that kind of stuff, then you measure the sequestration rather than the growth of the trees, but actually in the transpiration of what's in the air, then it's virtually no sequestration when they're under stress. As you can imagine, a tree under stress, so it's stressed because of predators and possums eating all the leaves and all that kind of stuff, then the sequestration rate becomes zilch. So it's, and it would be the same in a pine forest too. But so the thing is that we need to make sure that we not only have the forest, but we have to look after them as well. We can't just let the predators go crazy, and we. So when it comes to doing good for the climate, then just as much about planting is to manage the forest that we have to make sure preserve. That we don't. Yeah.
Sorry, Emma. You see, possum are just not welcome here, unfortunately. As much as I like them myself, they're just...
I know, it's not their fault.
No.
I do want to go back to something though, Ben, because you touched on it, and I don't know if you understand, or if the listeners understand why it is that corporates like, or multinational corporates like Coca-Cola come to New Zealand and get our water for nothing. Do you know why that is, that they don't pay for it?
I can presume, but no, I'd rather let you.
Well, so it's because no government has been brave enough to take on the ownership issue.
Yeah,
so
yeah. I don't want to step in it.
Just, I know, but it's just a classic. And John Key was famous for this: nobody owns water.
Yeah.
Nobody owns water because they don't want to say who does own water, because then they'll have a problem. They'll have to deal with the treaty and who does own water in New Zealand. So it's, again, and this government's putting it off. There is a Waitangi Tribunal claim, Y2358, that I'm part of, well, I'm a witness on, where the Māori Council is putting a claim in for freshwater. And so all it is these...
But is that claim genuine? Is that claim to monetize? Or is that claim to protect?
No, it's just ownership. And then once you know who owns it, then you can figure out who's going to look after it and all that kind of thing. Right. At the moment, it's like, we'll pretend that no one owns it, and these other countries just go, well, here we go. These guys are mugs. There's no price for water here. So we pretend that there's no price. And that means if there's no price on something, it's a free-for-all, and no one looks after it. It's the tragedy of the commons. It's like, who cares? I might as well have it, because if I don't get it, someone else will get it, kind of thing. It doesn't have a... So that's why, that's the core issue there. And while people go, oh, well, nobody owns water in New Zealand, I just advise people to get online and have a look at a website called Hydro Trader, and it's like a brokerage, and it's Canterbury mostly, and it's many hundreds of millions of dollars of water are traded in New Zealand, for irrigation in Canterbury, and it adds millions, literally, per property, up to millions of dollars per property in land value, because of the right to take that water. So who gave that landowner the right to that water? Nobody asked, the Indigenous people of New Zealand. Nobody asked me if they could have it. It was just a right that went with that land ownership, that they can have it. And so no one's ever been asked. It's been given away on our behalf to the people that happen to own the land that's in the vicinity of it. And so that's another huge issue for us to work out.
Now it's very easy to feel very down and beaten and angry. And as I keep sipping my water, I keep wondering, should I, shouldn't I? Let's talk a little bit about solutions. Let's talk about the way forward. We want to eventually touch a little bit on the Better Futures Forum, which that's, I think, important. But until we get to that, two sort of facets. What are the big picture solutions that could work, and what can we as individuals contribute to that in terms of our daily habits, choices we make, and so on?
Well, this is a big problem, because 90-odd% or more than 90% of the milk products in New Zealand don't get sold in New Zealand. So dairy is a big problem for our freshwater in New Zealand, but our consumer choice, what we do, will make no choice, unless what we do politically will make a choice. We have a choice about which government we vote in, and that kind of thing. But as far as consumer choice, we don't really have a choice. I'm sure that Fonterra wouldn't care less if we all tomorrow stop drinking milk, because it's all about milk powder, and there's a whole lot of ethical issues about that we could go into about where it all goes to. But so that's why there's not. That's why it's much harder for me to sort of talk about solutions for that problem. As far as for the farming industry, then individual farmers are just caught up in the meat in the sandwich here, between really high debt levels, getting constantly flooded with advice from fertilizer companies telling them to put more and more stuff on. They're caught up, and you owe so much money on the farm. The farm's overvalued because there's been a premium. The money's made in capital gains. Like all of those dairy farms in Canterbury that weren't there 20 years ago were sheep farms, and they were worth about 1/10 of what they're worth now. So you put water on them, you put cows on them, the land value goes up. The next, you sell it and walk away, retire on your millions of dollars, and then the next person has to borrow all that money. We have incredibly high debt levels on our farms now. So this is why it's a very hard problem to fix. It's a bit like the housing bubble that we have all over the country, but especially in Auckland, where these things are the people have made money on the capital gains, not from producing anything or doing anything valuable, just the capital gain and the debt that's now tied up with all New Zealanders and all New Zealand farmers, or not, or most of them, based on that capital gain. So it's a real tough one. That one is to fix.
So it's easy to talk about, shifting to plant-based sort of agricultural system, but exactly what you've been saying now, it's if they're tied down to debt, they're tied down to a lot of contracts, that's not easy to move away from.
No. But
much bigger systemic problem.
Yeah, it is a huge problem, and we do need to change the system, exactly. But I mean, there is a heap of evidence now that you can put way less into your dairy farm and make more profit. I mean, the loveliest, nicest dairy farms that I've been to are the ones that have cut right back. They go on to once a day milking. They stop putting nitrogen on. They virtually stop any fertilizer going on there. Their herd size is halved. Their cows are happier. Their land is happier. Their dogs and kids and everybody is so much less stressed and happier. And that's a great option if you don't owe a fortune, and so it's only an option for some of the people who do it.
So the stories we see, the success stories, that's really few and far between, rather than a lead toward a change, because so many just can't join that path.
No, but I mean, it is changing fast, and I own the power of those, and I mean, they fight really hard. I mean, from Fonterra's point of view, it's all about volume, and they've kind of overcapitalized on dryers now, so they need to have lots of milk coming in, volume of milk. Whether farmers make any profit or not is kind of not a worry. If your job, you set the price and you sell it, then you don't care. So again, farmers are kind of stuck in this tricky space there, where they have to respond to that. But there's this growing, regenerative farming movement. Organic farming is doing really, much higher returns on organic milk products at the moment. I went to a conference in Christchurch last year, in Canterbury, late last year, and a couple of hundred people in the room who are regenerative farmers, who are and a lot of them are young. They're not all young, but just some really exciting buzz about the options that are happening. And on Pure Advantage have been doing a campaign. So on the Pure Advantage website, there's a whole bunch of videos you can watch, and there's just this massive upwelling. And it's bottom up. It's not coming from government. Ministry of Primary Industries is just totally lagging on this stuff, and which is typical for anything. I think that the ground up movement doesn't come from government; it comes from people who want to do the right thing. So I mean, it's not all bad. There is definitely a lot happening around changing farming systems away from high intensity and high input into much healthier, happier, low intensity, high quality products.
Yeah. And are there other solutions around how we use water, or ways to rely less on water? And I was thinking about whether I bring this up or not, but on a recent interview on the news, you spoke about composting toilets. It was all a bit of a joke, but actually there's some merit to that.
Oh yeah, I mean, I just use my example of Heidi's house in Kirikiriroa, Hamilton, and I used to take my students there. I had a field trip of environmental students that I took on the road every year, and we would go and visit Heidi's house, and it's 10 years ago or more now that she built this. Her and her husband, who were both architects, built this house. I mean, there's sort of eco houses around. People are familiar with them. Mostly they're big mansions in the country, but this was a little house, not a tiny house, but a 2-bedroom house in Kirikiriroa, in a suburban, well, actually quite close to the centre of the city, completely off grid for wastewater and for drinking water, and soon to be for energy. And so they could catch all of their own rainwater, a big tank under the house, to supply all their own drinking water, all of the wastewater, including the sewage. So it was not, I think people think of that, of some sort of toilet with just throwing sawdust on it. This was a flushing toilet, but it went into its own garden uptake system with flaxes and rushes and all that kind of thing. Very simple, very basic, very inexpensive. And it had a flow field that went out into the garden, but she'd had it running for years, and the water had never actually made it out to the flow field, because the initial, the toilet went into a worm farm first and then into a flax garden. And the uptake by the plants and the worms meant that there was nothing left to go out into the flow field, but it's there as a backup, and it's so cheap and so simple, for a few $1,000s. I mean, I've got a neighbor here just spent $35,000 on a septic tank system. If you follow the plumbing standards, it means you have to put in this huge massive multi-chamber plastic system with a big fat electric pump on it, which means that when the power goes off, the toilet stops working. This is kind of what the standards call for. But so anyway, I mean, when I saw the system and when my students saw it, in each time, everyone was so excited that this could change everything in New Zealand. It's so simple that you could put this into practice in all of our houses and not have these great big huge ugly wastewater treatment plants that bypass and mean that people can't swim and all that kind of stuff. You could have these really good systems within your property, collect your own drinking water as well. And just such a shame that it just never took off. And I know that, I know we're running out of time, but one of the problems, and I don't know how you get around this issue, is that a lot of the new houses that are being built, that they were keen, Ian Mays at the City Council, who's their Eco House guy, was really excited about it as well. But he said that the average ownership period in those new subdivisions in Kirikiriroa is 18 months.
Oh gosh, okay.
Yeah, so you're not gonna they would, like he said, they'd invest in a spa pool or a granite bench top, rather kind of thing, because you're just not going to stay there. So,
which is going to get changed out in a few years. Yet the return of investment of putting something that's so long term is and the benefits.
Yeah, I know, that's the thing. If because we value the wrong things the wrong way, but if we were going to stay in a house, and it would be such a big incentive to make sure that if we were paying the true costs for the harm that we do, then we would set up our houses to be not on the grid and not on sewage systems and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. So talk to us a little bit about the Better Futures Forum.
Okay. Well, it came out of the lockdown. It was a bunch of people that I know who were thinking, wow, we were all blown away, like I'm sure you were, about how when the pressure's on, when something's in our face, like getting COVID and dying, how quickly we as individuals and the government can change.
Actually change, yeah.
Yeah, and for a lot of people, just how cool it was. I mean, I know it was really tough on many people, but that slowing down and that not having cars, and so I just had this vision for how New Zealand could look, and you can have a look. I was invited to write something for the Canvas magazine and the New Zealand Herald and the Weekender a while ago, and it was just to envisage a future where we took back the streets from cars, and where we didn't spend our whole lives kind of striving to go on overseas trips and all that kind of thing, and we did change to away from intensive farming and into regenerative farming where people would want to work on the land because it's not just this big monoculture of grass with big machines running around on it. So it's kind of envisaging, and a bunch of people who were thinking along the same lines, and we just thought we'd start up this Better Futures Forum and try and get a ground up movement of people to demand change. I totally think that my experience has been that governments don't do these things by themselves. We make governments do it, and that was the idea of it.
So supporting people to not go back to normal because normal doesn't work.
Yeah, like I was trying to explain that if normal is ecocide, if you could, because people say, oh, that's pretty radical, isn't it? And no, actually, what we're doing now is radical. If you could kind of just get out of your mind, or think of yourself as a Martian coming down to Earth and looking at how we live, what we're doing to our rivers, what we're doing to our plastics and nitrates and carbon in the atmosphere and all that kind of thing. You would just look at humans on this planet and shake your head and just think this is just so incredibly stupid that these people must be idiots. It's radical what we're doing at the moment, and so the kind of changes that I talked about, that we talk about in Better Futures, are not radical. They're the opposite to radical. They're conservative, and kind of thinking of the future and thinking about how our kids are gonna live. And
you focus on quite a broad variety of facets: land and water, infrastructure, transport, building and housing, energy, and the economy. So there's a lot of sort of topics that all interrelated, of course, but all need.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, Ben, is that we're systems thinkers. The people that came together realized we know. I mean, the opposite to systems is government. Where you have a Ministry of Agriculture and a Ministry of Health, and you break it all up as if these are individual things. And I think that's a big reason why we never get anywhere. In fact, we go backwards. It's because we silo these things, and of course they are all interlinked. And having said that, what I did realize is that, I have realized for a long time, is that what we're actually talking about there, I mean, as a Western scientist, I talk about, systems and systems thinking, but of course it's indigenous. It's an indigenous worldview. The interconnectedness is something, that understanding of ecology and how we're humans and all life and everything is interconnected is at the core of indigenous knowledge. So it's kind of a bit arrogant to think of it as a something new. It's actually something incredibly old and at the core of beliefs of many indigenous communities around the world.
Better Futures Forum, is this a platform where people can contribute or become a part of or support in any way?
Yep. So everybody can, and we really want that to happen. So it's bff.org.nz, and you can join up on there. It's actually, we've got some deadlines that we're coming close to. There's been a heap of work happening already, and some great ideas that we'll be able to release first. We'll be able to release soon, but we have been working on them. And one of the things that, just to make sure that we think about how everything interlinks, those different disciplines that you talk about, we'll be pulling all that together and making some statements soon. But yeah, definitely anyone can be involved, and we encourage people to be involved.
Brilliant.
Fantastic. And, if you ever do start an Australian arm.
well, yeah, you actually, yeah. One of the sort of core members is a guy called Shane Ward, who's in Melbourne at the moment, and he's been over there for a few years. He's an expert in regenerative farming, but he's coming back to New Zealand at the moment. But yeah, I mean, there's that's something that you could do, Emma. You could start up the Australian wing.
Sure. Why not?
There we go. There we go. Dr. Mike Joy, it's been an absolute enlightening conversation. I know this can go on and on and on. For those that want to learn more, there's a number of interviews and presentations that you have done on YouTube. It's relatively easy to find. We will put a couple of links up on our show notes to some of the websites. But thank you so much for giving us I guess, a real state of affairs, what the real situation is. It's about awareness. Like you say, we can't always create a change or say, okay, what can I do to change? But awareness can sometimes lead to ideas. It can lead to eventually a change in some form or other. So, I think this has been one of the most informative podcasts we've had so far, because it's so much of what we don't see. It's so much what we don't realize. And it's a real reality check. So thank you for your time. Really, really appreciate that. And best of luck with the Better Future Forum for sure.
And the time is now. So thank you.
Thank you. Cheers. Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to the Lentil Intervention Podcast. If you found this interesting, make sure you subscribe and share it with your friends.